March 14, 1945, 03:47 hours. The air above Remagen, Germany, smelled like wet concrete and cordite. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the shattered span of the Ludendorff Bridge, a German MG-42 machine gun chattered in short, disciplined bursts, each one a metallic reminder that the Wehrmacht still had teeth. Private First Class Eugene Callahan crouched in a bomb crater, 30 yards from a reinforced concrete pillbox, his hands wrapped around something that looked like it had been assembled in a junkyard by a man who'd lost a bet. It was a flamethrower, or at least that's what Callahan called it. His platoon had other names for it: the contraption, the suicide stick, the death trap special. Sergeant Morrison, a bull-necked Texan with a voice like gravel in a cement mixer, had taken one look at Callahan's creation 2 days earlier and laughed so hard he'd nearly choked on his lucky strike. The thing was a mess of mismatched parts. A fuel tank scavenged from a wrecked Kübelwagen, copper tubing stolen from a bombed-out brewery in Bonn, a hand pump that Callahan had pried off an agricultural sprayer in a burned farmhouse, and an ignition system jerry-rigged from a combination of a Zippo lighter, piano wire, and what appeared to be the firing mechanism of a German Panzerfaust. The whole assembly was held together with electrical tape, baling wire, and what Callahan himself described as aggressive optimism. Callahan was 22 years old, rail-thin, with a face that seemed perpetually smudged with grease and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses he'd repaired so many times with tape that they looked like a school project. Before the war, he'd worked as a mechanic in a garage outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, the kind of place where men brought tractors with busted carburetors and left with machinery that purred like house cats. His father had been a plumber, his grandfather a blacksmith, and Callahan had inherited from both of them an intuitive understanding of how things worked, or more importantly, how to make things work when they shouldn't. He'd joined the 9th Armored Division in the summer of 1943, assigned to a rifle company that spent most of its time slogging through mud and wondering when the next hot meal would arrive. His platoon had crossed the Rhine 3 days earlier, part of the chaotic push to secure the Ludendorff Bridge before the Germans could demolish it completely. They'd made it across barely, under a hail of artillery fire that had turned the eastern bank into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. The problem they faced now was a textbook example of why the Germans were so damn hard to kill. The pillbox sat on a low rise overlooking the approach to a secondary road that led deeper into German-held territory. It was a squat, ugly thing, built from reinforced concrete at least 2 feet thick, with a firing slit just wide enough for the barrel of an MG-42 and the cold eyes of whoever was feeding it ammunition. The Germans inside had a clear line of sight on any approach, and they'd already chewed up 2 attempts to flank them. 6 men were dead, another 4 wounded, and Captain Hendricks, the company commander, was running out of patience and options. They'd called for a tank, but the nearest Sherman was bogged down in the mud 2 miles back, and air support was grounded because of the weather. Artillery was out of the question. They were too close to friendly positions, and the brass didn't want to risk blowing a hole in their own lines. That left infantry, and infantry meant getting close enough to the pillbox to either blow it open or burn it out. Callahan had been listening to the debate in the command post, a shell-blasted cellar that smelled like mildew and fear, when he'd had the idea. The company had 2 standard-issue M2 flamethrowers, both of them excellent pieces of equipment when they worked, which was about half the time. The problem was that the M2 weighed 68 pounds fully loaded, had a range of about 20 to 40 yards, depending on wind conditions, and required the operator to stand upright and expose himself to enemy fire for the 3 to 5 seconds it took to discharge a burst. The Germans had figured this out early in the war, and their standard response to seeing a flamethrower operator was to concentrate every available weapon on him until he either dropped the flamethrower or exploded in a spectacular fireball that made excellent propaganda footage. Callahan's idea was different. What if you didn't need to carry the flamethrower? What if you could build something lighter, something you could set up and fire from cover, something that didn't require you to stand up and paint a target on your chest? He'd spent the next 18 hours scrounging parts and assembling his device, working by candlelight in a barn while the rest of the platoon tried to sleep. The fuel tank held about 3 gallons of a mixture Callahan had concocted himself: gasoline, motor oil, and a thickening agent he'd scraped out of soap bars and melted down. The result was a sticky, viscous liquid that clung to whatever it touched and burned hot enough to peel paint off metal. The ignition system was the tricky part. Standard flamethrowers used a pressurized ignition cartridge, but Callahan didn't have access to those. Instead, he'd rigged a spark plug from a motorcycle engine to fire when he squeezed a makeshift trigger, sending an electrical charge through a battery he'd salvaged from a dead radio. The spark would ignite a pilot flame fueled by a strip of cloth soaked in lighter fluid, and that in turn would ignite the fuel stream as it sprayed out of the nozzle. In theory, Callahan had tested it once briefly behind the barn, and the result had been a gout of flame about 15 feet long that had singed his eyebrows and set fire to a pile of hay. It worked, sort of. When he'd presented the device to Sergeant Morrison, the reaction had been predictable. Morrison had stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Callahan, then back at the device. He'd asked if Callahan had lost his mind. Callahan had replied that he probably had, but that didn't change the fact that they needed a way to deal with the pillbox, and this was the best idea he had. Morrison had grunted, spat tobacco juice into the dirt, and said that if Callahan wanted to blow himself up, he was welcome to do it on his own time. But Captain Hendricks, who'd been listening from the doorway, had stepped forward and examined the flamethrower more closely. Hendricks was a West Point graduate, the kind of officer who actually read the field manuals and believed in combined arms tactics. But he was also pragmatic enough to know that sometimes you had to improvise. He'd asked Callahan if he thought it would work. Callahan had shrugged and said he thought it had a better than even chance, which in his experience was about as good as you could hope for in a war. Hendricks had nodded and told him to give it a try. If it worked, Callahan would get a commendation. If it didn't, well, they'd scrape up what was left of him and send it home in a small box. Now, crouched in the crater with the flamethrower resting across his knees, Callahan ran through the plan one more time. The pillbox was 30 yards away, close enough that he could see the muzzle flash of the MG-42 every time it fired. The approach was open ground, no cover except for a few shell craters and the remnants of a stone wall that had been reduced to rubble by artillery. Callahan's plan was to crawl forward to the wall, set up the flamethrower, and aim for the firing slit. If he could get a burst of flame through the opening, the heat and smoke would force the Germans out, and the rest of the platoon could finish them off. If the flamethrower didn't work, or if the Germans spotted him before he could fire, he'd be dead before he hit the ground. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only one they had. He checked the fuel tank one last time, making sure the seals were tight and the pressure was holding. The hand pump was crude, but it worked. A few quick strokes would build up enough pressure to spray the fuel mixture out in a stream. The ignition system was the weak link. Callahan had tested it twice more since the barn, and both times it had worked, but that didn't mean it would work when he needed it to. Batteries were temperamental, especially in cold weather, and the spark plug was already showing signs of corrosion. He'd cleaned it as best he could, but there was no way to know for sure until he squeezed the trigger. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and tried to ignore the fact that his hands were shaking. It wasn't fear, exactly. Or maybe it was. Callahan had never been good at distinguishing between fear and adrenaline. They felt the same to him, a tightness in his chest and a buzzing in his ears that made it hard to think clearly. Sergeant Morrison appeared at the edge of the crater, moving in a low crouch that made him look like a bear trying to sneak through a henhouse. He dropped down next to Callahan and handed him a canteen. Callahan took a sip, tasting the metallic tang of iodine tablets, and handed it back. Morrison asked if he was ready. Callahan said he was, which was a lie, but Morrison didn't push. Instead, he pointed to the pillbox and told Callahan that the rest of the squad would provide covering fire once he started his approach. They'd aim for the firing slit, try to keep the Germans' heads down, but Callahan shouldn't expect miracles. The MG-42 had a rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, and the Germans inside had plenty of ammunition. If Callahan hesitated, if he gave them even a second to draw a bead on him, they'd cut him in half. Morrison clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt more like a goodbye, and crawled back to his position. Callahan waited for the signal, a single flare that would arc up into the night sky and bathe the battlefield in sickly green light. When it came, he moved. He scrambled out of the crater and sprinted toward the stone wall, his boots slipping on the wet ground, the flamethrower clutched to his chest like a grotesque infant. Behind him, he heard the sharp crack of M1 Garands and the deeper thump of a Browning automatic rifle as his squad opened fire. Tracers streaked through the darkness, red lines drawn in the air, and the MG-42 answered with its own chattering roar. Callahan didn't look back. He focused on the wall, on the patch of shadow behind it, and on the 10 yards of open ground he still had to cross. A bullet whined past his head, close enough that he felt the displacement of air, and another kicked up dirt at his feet. He dove the last few yards and slammed into the rubble, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending a lance of pain through his ribs. He lay there for a moment, gasping, his ears ringing from the gunfire. The flamethrower had landed next to him, somehow still intact. He ran his hands over it, checking for damage, and found none. The fuel tank was dented but not leaking, the tubing was still connected, and the ignition system looked intact. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. Maybe his luck was holding after all. He crawled forward until he had a clear view of the pillbox, just 20 yards away now. The firing slit was a black rectangle in the grey concrete, and he could see the muzzle of the MG-42 swiveling back and forth, searching for targets. The Germans inside were shouting to each other, their voices sharp and urgent, and Callahan realized they hadn't seen him yet. They were focused on the squad, on the volume of fire coming from the crater, and they didn't know he was there. He set up the flamethrower, bracing the fuel tank against a chunk of rubble and angling the nozzle toward the firing slit. His hands moved quickly, mechanically, the way they always did when he was working on an engine or fixing a piece of equipment. This was just another problem to solve, another mechanism to coax into life. He worked the hand pump, feeling the pressure build, and checked the pilot light. The cloth strip was still soaked with lighter fluid, and he lit it with his Zippo, shielding the flame with his body so the Germans wouldn't see. The pilot light caught, a small guttering flame that danced in the darkness. Callahan positioned himself behind the flamethrower, his finger on the trigger, and took aim. The firing slit was narrow, maybe 6 inches wide, but it was enough. If he could get the fuel stream through that opening, the Germans inside wouldn't have anywhere to go. He squeezed the trigger. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, and Callahan's heart dropped into his boots. Then the spark plug fired, the pilot light flared, and the fuel mixture erupted from the nozzle in a roaring stream of orange and yellow flame. The stream was narrower than he'd expected, more focused, and it shot forward like a lance of liquid fire. It hit the firing slit dead center, and Callahan watched as the flame poured through the opening and into the pillbox. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Germans inside started screaming, high-pitched and animal, the kind of sound that men make when they're burning alive. Black smoke began pouring out of the firing slit, thick and greasy, and Callahan caught the smell of burning flesh mixed with something else, something chemical and acrid that made his eyes water. He held the trigger down, pumping more fuel into the mix, feeding the fire until the entire interior of the pillbox was an inferno. 23 seconds. That's how long he held the trigger before the fuel ran out and the flames sputtered and died. 23 seconds to reduce a reinforced concrete bunker to a crematorium. Callahan released the trigger and sat back, his hands trembling, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The pillbox was silent now, except for the crackle of flames and the occasional pop of ammunition cooking off in the heat. The MG-42 had stopped firing. No one was coming out. Sergeant Morrison appeared at his side, along with 2 other soldiers, their faces pale and slack with shock. Morrison stared at the pillbox, then at Callahan, then at the flamethrower. He asked what the hell that thing was, and Callahan, still too wired to think of anything clever, just said it was a flamethrower. Morrison shook his head, muttered something about crazy mechanics, and ordered the rest of the squad to move up and secure the position. The celebration was brief. Captain Hendricks arrived 10 minutes later, picking his way through the cratered landscape with the careful steps of a man who'd seen too many friends die from stepping on mines. He examined the pillbox from a distance first, his binoculars trained on the smoking firing slit, then moved closer with his sidearm drawn. The stench hit him before he reached the entrance, a nauseating mixture of burned meat, melted rubber, and something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. He didn't go inside, he didn't need to. The heat radiating from the concrete told him everything he needed to know about what had happened to the four-man crew that had been stationed there. He walked back to where Callahan was sitting on a piece of rubble, still clutching the now empty flamethrower, and asked if he could build another one. Callahan looked up at him, his face streaked with soot and sweat, and asked why. Hendricks pointed east, toward the dark outline of hills beyond the river, and told him there were 17 more pillboxes between their current position and the town of Honif, and Division wanted them cleared by dawn. The math was simple and brutal. 17 pillboxes, each one built to the same specifications as the one Callahan had just destroyed. Reinforced concrete walls, interlocking fields of fire, and crews of German soldiers who knew they were defending their homeland and had nowhere left to retreat. The standard doctrine for dealing with fortified positions called for combined arms assaults, using tanks to suppress the positions while infantry moved in with satchel charges or flamethrowers to finish the job. But the ground was too soft for armor, the weather too poor for air support, and the timeline too tight for the kind of methodical reduction that doctrine recommended. What Hendricks needed was something fast, something mobile, and something that could be operated by soldiers who weren't trained flamethrower specialists. He needed Callahan's contraption, and he needed at least 5 more of them before nightfall. Callahan did the calculations in his head: parts, assembly time, fuel mixture ratios. He told Hendricks he could do it, but he'd need help, and he'd need access to every scrapyard, bombed-out vehicle, and abandoned building within a 5-mile radius. Hendricks said he'd give him whatever he needed, plus 6 men to help with the scavenging and assembly. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that if Callahan's devices worked as well as the first one had, he'd recommend him for a silver star. If they didn't work, and men died because of faulty equipment, Hendricks would personally shoot him. By 1100 hours, Callahan had transformed a partially collapsed warehouse into an improvised workshop that looked like something between a mad scientist's laboratory and a chop shop for stolen cars. Long wooden tables salvaged from farmhouses were covered with an organized chaos of parts. Fuel tanks of various sizes, copper and steel tubing cut to length, hand pumps, spark plugs, batteries, rolls of wire, spools of tape, and containers of fuel mixture in glass bottles that Callahan had marked with crude labels. 6 soldiers moved through the space, with the purposeful confusion of assembly line workers, each one assigned a specific task. Private Kowalski, a machinist from Detroit who could weld anything to anything given enough time and acetylene, was fabricating mounting brackets and pressure valves from scrap metal. Corporal Diaz, who'd worked in his family's hardware store in San Antonio and knew every size bolt and fitting by feel, was organizing the plumbing components and testing connections for leaks. Private First Class O'Brien, the squad's demolitions expert and a former coal miner from West Virginia, was mixing fuel batches according to Callahan's specifications, carefully measuring out gasoline, motor oil, and the soap-based thickening agent that gave the mixture its napalm-like consistency. The design evolved with each iteration. The first flamethrower had been a proof of concept, built with whatever Callahan could find and held together with hope and hardware store supplies. The second generation was more refined. Callahan standardized the fuel tank size at 4 gallons, which gave a firing time of about 30 seconds, and kept the overall weight under 40 pounds when fully loaded. He redesigned the ignition system, adding a backup spark plug and a second battery in parallel, reducing the chance of failure from a single electrical fault. The nozzle underwent 3 revisions before he was satisfied, settling on a tapered copper tube with an adjustable choke that allowed the operator to control the spray pattern from a narrow jet for maximum range to a wider cone for area suppression. The most significant improvement was the firing mechanism itself. The original trigger had been a simple switch that completed an electrical circuit, but Callahan replaced it with a 2-stage system. The first pull pressurized the fuel line, the second initiated ignition. This gave the operator more control and reduced the risk of accidental discharge, which was a significant concern given that they were building devices designed to spray flaming liquid in combat conditions. Testing was hasty and dangerous. Callahan set up a firing range behind the warehouse, using a burned-out German half-track as a target. Each device was test-fired once, just long enough to confirm ignition and check the spray pattern, before being declared ready for combat. The results were uneven. Flamethrower number 2 worked perfectly, producing a stream of fire that engulfed the half-track and burned hot enough to melt the aluminum engine block. Flamethrower number 3 suffered an electrical failure on the first trigger pull. Callahan traced it to a corroded battery terminal, replaced the battery, and got it working on the second attempt. Flamethrower number 4 had a fuel leak that nobody noticed until Kowalski pulled the trigger and the entire device burst into flames in his hands. Kowalski dropped it and dove for cover, escaping with singed eyebrows and a newfound respect for safety protocols. Callahan rebuilt the device from scratch, this time triple-checking every seal and connection. By 1600 hours, he had 6 functioning flamethrowers, each one tested and ready for deployment. It wasn't 17, but it was a start. The plan Hendricks laid out was aggressive, even by the standards of a division that had just pulled off the near-impossible feat of capturing the Ludendorff Bridge intact. The 17 pillboxes were arrayed in 3 defensive lines, each one positioned to cover the approaches to Honnef and the critical road network beyond. The first line consisted of 5 pillboxes, spaced roughly 300 yards apart, along a ridge overlooking the river valley. The second line, 4 pillboxes, was set back another quarter-mile in a staggered formation that covered the gaps in the first line. The third line, 8 pillboxes, formed a semicircular defensive perimeter around Honnef itself. German doctrine called for defenders in each line to hold their positions until overrun, then fall back to the next line, buying time for reinforcements or for engineers to prepare demolitions that would deny key terrain to the attackers. Hendricks' plan was to hit all 3 lines simultaneously, using speed and violence to overwhelm the defenders before they could coordinate their response. 3 rifle companies would advance in parallel, each one assigned a sector and equipped with 2 of Callahan's flamethrowers. Callahan himself would accompany the center company, both to provide technical support if the devices malfunctioned, and because Hendricks didn't trust anyone else to keep the damn things working. They moved out at 1800 hours, just as the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping toward freezing. The landscape was a devastated patchwork of farmland and forest, churned up by weeks of artillery fire and aerial bombardment. The roads were impassable, blocked by craters and rubble, so they moved cross-country, following a route that Hendricks had scouted earlier in the day with a reconnaissance patrol. The going was slow and miserable. The ground was a mixture of mud and partially frozen earth that sucked at boots and made every step an exercise in endurance. The soldiers moved in single file, weapons at the ready, scanning the tree line for snipers and the ground for mines. Callahan walked in the middle of the column, carrying one of the flamethrowers strapped to a wooden frame that distributed the weight across his shoulders. It was still heavy, and the fuel sloshed in the tank with every step, but it was manageable. Behind him, Private Kowalski carried a second flamethrower, and behind Kowalski came the rest of the squad, 40 men in varying states of exhaustion and nervousness. The first pillbox appeared as a dark silhouette against the twilight sky, positioned on the forward slope of the ridge, exactly where the reconnaissance report had said it would be. Hendricks called a halt and brought up his platoon leaders for a quick conference. The pillbox was identical in design to the one Callahan had destroyed earlier. Reinforced concrete, firing slit-oriented to cover the approach from the west, probably a 4-man crew with an MG-42 and enough ammunition to hold off a company-sized assault. The difference was that this time, the Germans were alert. They'd heard about the fall of the first pillbox, and they knew something was coming. Hendricks could see movement in the firing slit, shadows shifting as the crew adjusted their weapon and scanned the darkening landscape for targets. A direct assault would be suicide. Even with covering fire, anyone trying to cross the 200 yards of open ground would be cut down long before they got close enough to use grenades or satchel charges. That left Callahan and his flamethrower. The approach was a nightmare. Callahan and Kowalski crawled forward on their bellies, dragging the flamethrowers behind them like oversized luggage, while the rest of the platoon provided sporadic covering fire to mask their movement. The ground was cold and wet, and within minutes Callahan's uniform was soaked through and caked with mud. His glasses kept fogging up, forcing him to stop every few yards to wipe them clean with fingers that were rapidly going numb from the cold. Behind him, Kowalski was breathing hard, his exhalations visible in the freezing air, and muttering a continuous stream of profanity in Polish and English. The MG-42 fired in short bursts, probing shots aimed at suspected positions, and every time it fired, Callahan pressed his face into the mud and prayed that the gunner hadn't spotted them. The crawl took 20 minutes to cover 100 yards, and by the time they reached the shelter of a small depression in the ground, Callahan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate the flamethrower's pump mechanism. He forced himself to focus. This was just another mechanical problem, another system that needed to function under less than ideal conditions. He ran through the checklist in his mind. Fuel pressure, ignition system, nozzle alignment, everything seemed intact. He worked the pump, building pressure in the fuel line, and checked the pilot light. The cloth strip was damp from the crawl, and it took 3 tries with his Zippo before it caught. The flame was weak and guttering, but it would have to do. He positioned the flamethrower, bracing it against the edge of the depression, and aimed for the firing slit. The range was about 40 yards, right at the upper limit of the device's effective reach, and he knew the stream would lose coherence and heat over that distance. But he didn't have a choice. Getting closer would mean exposing himself to direct fire from the MG-42, and that was a death sentence. He glanced back at Kowalski, who gave him a thumbs up that might have been encouraging or might have been sarcastic. It was hard to tell with Kowalski. Callahan took a deep breath, offered a quick prayer to whatever deity looked after fools and mechanics, and squeezed the trigger. The flamethrower roared to life, spitting a stream of burning fuel that arced through the darkness like a meteor. The range was longer than his first shot, and the stream lost some of its cohesion, breaking up into droplets of flaming liquid that sprayed across the front of the pillbox. Most of it hit the concrete and splashed harmlessly, but enough of it found the firing slit. Callahan watched as the flame poured through the opening, smaller and less concentrated than before, but still deadly. The screaming started almost immediately, high and panicked, and the MG-42 went silent. Callahan held the trigger down, pumping more fuel into the fire, watching as black smoke began to pour from the firing slit. Then, with a suddenness that startled him, the door at the back of the pillbox flew open, and 2 German soldiers stumbled out, their uniforms smoking, their faces blackened with soot. They made it 3 steps before rifle fire from Callahan's platoon cut them down. The pillbox fell silent. Callahan released the trigger and sat back, his heart hammering in his chest. 1 down, 16 to go. The assault on the second defensive line began at 2130 hours, under conditions that can only be described as apocalyptic. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and a freezing rain had started to fall, turning the already treacherous ground into a skating rink of mud and ice. Visibility was down to less than 50 yards, and the darkness was broken only by the occasional flare and the muzzle flashes of weapons fire. Callahan's company had successfully reduced 4 of the 5 pillboxes in the first line, losing 11 men in the process, 6 killed and 5 wounded badly enough to require evacuation. The 5th pillbox had been knocked out by a lucky shot from a bazooka team that had managed to put a rocket through the firing slit on their 3rd attempt, turning the interior into a blast furnace that killed the crew instantly. Now they were facing the second line, and the Germans had figured out what was happening. They'd watched the first line fall, watched the gouts of flame that preceded each pillbox going silent, and they'd adapted their tactics accordingly. The problem revealed itself when Callahan and his squad approached the 6th pillbox, a reinforced position set into the side of a small hill with excellent fields of fire and what appeared to be additional defensive measures that hadn't been present in the earlier positions. As they crawled into range, Callahan noticed something that made his blood run cold. The firing slit had been partially blocked from the inside with sandbags, leaving only a narrow opening at the top, maybe 2 inches high and 6 inches wide. It was still large enough for the barrel of the MG-42, but it was too small for the flamethrower stream to penetrate effectively. The Germans had learned. They'd realized that the standard firing slit was their vulnerability, and they'd modified their defenses to counter the new threat. Callahan lay in the mud, studying the pillbox through his rain-streaked glasses, and tried to work out a solution. The blocked firing slit meant he couldn't pour flame directly into the interior the way he had with the earlier positions. He could spray the exterior, but reinforced concrete doesn't burn. and the crew inside would be safe as long as they stayed away from the opening. He needed a different approach. Callahan studied the pillbox's construction, noting the ventilation ports near the roofline, small rectangular openings designed to allow air circulation and prevent carbon monoxide buildup from the machine gun. Standard German engineering, practical and efficient, and in this case potentially exploitable. The vents were higher up, maybe 8 feet off the ground, but they were larger than the modified firing slit, and they opened directly into the interior. If he could get a stream of burning fuel through one of those vents, the smoke and heat would fill the interior in seconds, forcing the crew to either abandon their position or suffocate. The problem was angle and range. The vents were too high for a ground-level shot, and getting closer would mean exposing himself to fire from adjacent pillboxes. He needed elevation. Callahan scanned the area and spotted a pile of rubble about 30 yards to the left, the remains of a stone wall that had been knocked down by artillery. If he could get on top of that pile, he'd have the height and angle he needed. It would also make him a perfect target, silhouetted against the night sky. But perfection had stopped being an option around the time he'd volunteered for this mission. The move to the rubble pile was a controlled sprint through hell. Callahan went first, carrying the flamethrower at port arms with Kowalski and 2 riflemen providing covering fire. The MG-42 opened up immediately, the characteristic buzzsaw sound tearing through the night, and Callahan felt rounds snap past his head close enough to part his hair. He didn't slow down. He focused on the rubble pile, on the dark mass of stones ahead, and on keeping his feet under him on the treacherous ground. He hit the pile at full speed and scrambled up the loose stones, his boots slipping and sliding, the flamethrower banging against his ribs. A bullet struck the fuel tank with a metallic clang that sent Callahan's heart into his throat, but the tank held. The round had hit at an angle and glanced off, leaving a bright scar in the metal but no penetration. Callahan reached the top of the pile, dropped prone and set up the flamethrower with hands that were operating on pure muscle memory, because his conscious mind had temporarily shut down from terror. He had one shot. The angle was good, the range was manageable at about 45 yards, and he had a clear line of sight to the ventilation ports. The MG-42 was still firing, but the gunner hadn't spotted him yet. The muzzle was tracking targets down and to the right, where the rest of the squad was keeping the Germans busy. Callahan worked the pump, building pressure, and checked the ignition system. The pilot light was still burning, a small miracle given the wind and rain. He aimed for the leftmost ventilation port, compensating for wind drift and the slight upward angle, and squeezed the trigger. The flamethrower responded with a roar that seemed loud enough to wake the dead, and a stream of burning fuel shot upward in a perfect arc. Callahan watched it climb, watched it reach the apex of its trajectory, watched it begin to descend. For a moment he thought he'd miscalculated, that the stream would fall short and splash harmlessly against the concrete. Then physics and fluid dynamics and sheer dumb luck aligned, and the burning fuel poured through the ventilation port like water down a drain. The effect was even more dramatic than he'd hoped. The ventilation system acted like a chimney in reverse, drawing the flame and smoke down into the interior and distributing it throughout the enclosed space. Within seconds, thick black smoke was pouring out of every opening in the pillbox, the firing slit, the vents, even gaps around the rear door. Callahan held the trigger down, pumping fuel into the fire, watching as the smoke grew thicker and more voluminous. Then the rear door burst open, and German soldiers came stumbling out, coughing and choking, their hands raised in surrender. There were 4 of them, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes streaming tears. They collapsed in the mud, gasping for air, and made no resistance when American soldiers rushed forward to secure them. The MG-42 was silent. The pillbox was neutralized. Callahan released the trigger and allowed himself a moment to breathe. The technique worked. More importantly, it could be replicated. He'd just found a way to defeat the Germans' countermeasure. Word spread quickly through the attacking force. Callahan's innovation with the ventilation ports gave the assault new momentum. Over the next 4 hours, the remaining pillboxes fell in rapid succession. Some crews surrendered after the first burst of flame, having watched what happened to their comrades and deciding that survival was preferable to a pointless death in a concrete box. Others fought to the end, forcing the Americans to pump fire into their positions until the heat and smoke made continued resistance impossible. By 0200 hours on March 15th, the second defensive line was broken, and by 0430 hours, the third line was crumbling. The last pillbox, a reinforced position overlooking the main approach to Honef, fell at 0512 hours when Callahan, operating on pure adrenaline and approximately 0 hours of sleep, managed to pour burning fuel through a drainage pipe that the German engineers had thoughtfully included in their design and had forgotten to block. The final tally was both sobering and remarkable. 17 pillboxes neutralized in less than 12 hours. 47 German soldiers killed, another 62 captured, most of them suffering from burns, smoke inhalation, or a combination of both. American casualties were surprisingly light: 18 killed, 31 wounded, numbers that would have been catastrophically higher if they'd attempted conventional infantry assaults against prepared defensive positions. Callahan's improvised flamethrowers had proven devastatingly effective against fortifications that were designed to withstand artillery bombardment and tank fire. The psychological impact was equally significant. The speed of the American advance had disrupted German defensive plans, preventing the orderly withdrawal and demolition operations that might have delayed the Allied push deeper into Germany. By dawn on March 15th, elements of the 9th Armored Division were entering Honef, and the road network beyond was open. Captain Hendricks found Callahan sitting on the steps of a shot-up church in the outskirts of Honef, surrounded by the disassembled components of 6 flamethrowers that he was methodically cleaning and storing. The devices had performed beyond expectations, but they'd also been pushed to their limits. 3 had suffered mechanical failures during the night, 2 from electrical problems, and 1 from a fuel pump that had simply given up after the 4th pillbox. Callahan had field repaired all 3 under fire, working by flashlight while German machine gun rounds pinged off the rubble around him, because the alternative was watching men die trying to assault positions that his devices could neutralize in seconds. Hendricks sat down next to him, produced a flask of bourbon from his coat pocket, and offered it without a word. Callahan took a long drink, felt the liquor burn its way down his throat, and handed it back. Hendricks told him that Division Headquarters wanted a full report on the flamethrowers, complete technical specifications and operational doctrine, because they wanted to mass-produce the design and distribute it to every infantry company in Europe. Callahan nodded, too exhausted to feel anything resembling pride or satisfaction. The numbers told the story better than words ever could. 17 fortified positions eliminated with a total expenditure of approximately 180 gallons of fuel mixture at a cost of roughly $45 in scavenged materials and improvised components. By comparison, reducing the same positions through conventional means would have required extensive artillery preparation, multiple tank infantry assaults, and casualty figures that would have run into the hundreds. The United States Army Chemical Warfare Service had spent millions of dollars developing the M2 flamethrower, a sophisticated piece of equipment that required specialized training and was heavy enough to require dedicated operators. Callahan had built something more effective in a barn using parts from a junkyard. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the engineers and ordnance specialists who would spend the next several weeks trying to reverse engineer Callahan's design and turn it into something that could be manufactured in quantity. They would fail, mostly because Callahan's genius lay not in sophisticated engineering, but in practical improvisation, in the ability to look at a problem and cobble together a solution from whatever was at hand. That kind of creativity couldn't be standardized or mass-produced. Private First Class Eugene Callahan spent the rest of March 15th sleeping in the basement of the church, wrapped in a liberated German blanket and using a sandbag as a pillow. He slept for 14 hours straight, dead to the world, while his company pushed on toward the Rhine and the battles that lay beyond. When he finally woke, stiff and sore and still bone-tired, he found a Purple Heart and a Silver Star medal sitting on his helmet, along with a handwritten note from Captain Hendricks that read simply, "Well done." The medals meant less to him than the knowledge that his contraption had worked, that his improvised flamethrowers had saved American lives and helped break open a defensive line that could have stalled the advance for days or weeks. That night, Sitting in the ruins of Honef and watching supply trucks roll through the town on their way to the front, Callahan permitted himself a small measure of satisfaction. He'd taken a bunch of scrap metal and junkyard parts and turned them into something that changed the outcome of a battle. For a mechanic from Scranton, that was legacy enough. Eugene Callahan never became famous. His name doesn't appear in the popular histories of World War II, and if you visit the museums dedicated to the European theatre, you won't find his improvised flamethrowers displayed behind glass with bronze plaques explaining their significance. The official records acknowledge his Silver Star citation in the dry bureaucratic language that characterizes military documentation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy while serving with the 9th Armored Division near Remagen, Germany on March 14–15, 1945. The citation mentions his development of specialized equipment and his courage under fire, but it doesn't capture the full scope of what he accomplished or the lives he saved through sheer mechanical ingenuity and a refusal to accept that problems were unsolvable just because the manual didn't have an answer. The Army tried to replicate his design in the weeks following the Remagen breakthrough. Engineers from the Chemical Warfare Service descended on his unit with notebooks and cameras, documenting every detail of the flamethrowers, measuring dimensions, analyzing fuel mixture ratios, and interviewing Callahan about his construction techniques. They produced detailed technical drawings and specifications, forwarded them to ordnance depots and manufacturing facilities, and attempted to put the devices into production. The results were mixed at best. The manufactured versions worked technically, but they lacked the elegant simplicity of Callahan's originals. Factory-built models were heavier, more complex, and ironically less reliable than the devices assembled from scrap metal in a bombed-out warehouse. The problem, as one frustrated engineer noted in his report, was that Callahan's design wasn't really a design in the conventional sense. It was an improvisation, adapted and modified for specific conditions and specific materials, and it required someone with Callahan's intuitive understanding of mechanical systems to build and maintain. By the time the Army had standardized the design and tooled up for production, the war in Europe was over. The improved flamethrowers were shipped to the Pacific Theater, where they saw limited use in the final months of the war against Japan, but they never achieved the impact of those original 6 devices that Callahan had built in a single afternoon. Callahan himself returned to Scranton in December 1945, mustered out with the rank of technical sergeant and a modest collection of medals that he kept in a shoebox in his closet and rarely discussed. He went back to work at the garage where he'd been employed before the war, repairing tractors and automobiles with the same methodical competence that had served him so well in combat. He married in 1947, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life that gave no outward indication of what he'd accomplished during those desperate hours near Remagen. His children knew their father had served in the war, knew he'd been decorated for bravery, but they didn't know the details. Callahan didn't talk about it. Like many veterans of his generation, he considered the war a job that had needed doing, and once it was done, there was no point in dwelling on it. His wife once asked him about the Silver Star, about what he'd done to earn it, and he'd told her he'd fixed some equipment that had helped his unit capture a town. That was all. She never pressed for more. The story might have ended there, lost to history like so many other acts of individual courage and ingenuity, performed by ordinary soldiers in extraordinary circumstances, except for a chance encounter in 1987. A military historian researching the Remagen bridge operation came across a footnote in the 9th Armored Division's after-action reports that mentioned improvised flamethrowers used to reduce German defensive positions. Intrigued, the historian dug deeper, tracking down unit records, interviewing surviving veterans, and eventually locating Callahan himself, then 74 years old and still living in Scranton. The interview lasted 6 hours, conducted in Callahan's garage while he rebuilt a carburetor, and it produced a detailed account of those March days in 1945. The historian published an article in a military history journal, and suddenly, after more than 4 decades, people began to learn about the mechanic who'd turned junkyard scrap into weapons that had changed the course of a battle. Callahan was bemused by the attention. He gave a few interviews, answered questions from researchers, and politely declined invitations to speak at military conferences. He died in 1994 at the age of 71 from complications related to emphysema, possibly caused by years of exposure to smoke and chemical fumes, both during and after the war. The lesson of Eugene Callahan's story isn't about technology or tactics, though both are fascinating in their own right. It's about the power of practical intelligence, the kind of hands-on problem-solving creativity that doesn't require advanced degrees or specialized training, just a willingness to look at a problem from a different angle, and the confidence to try something that conventional wisdom says won't work. The military establishment had invested enormous resources in developing flamethrowers, producing sophisticated equipment that was reliable and effective, but also heavy, complex, and requiring specialized operators. Callahan had looked at the same problem and asked a different question. What if we didn't need sophisticated? What if we just needed something that worked right now with whatever we have available? That shift in perspective, from optimal to adequate, from perfect to functional, was what allowed him to create something revolutionary from components that other people would have dismissed as junk. It's a lesson that applies far beyond military operations, relevant to anyone facing resource constraints, time pressure, and problems that demand immediate solutions rather than perfect ones. The broader tragedy is how many stories like Callahan's remain untold, buried in archives and fading memories, lost because nobody thought to preserve them, or because the men who lived them didn't consider their actions worthy of remembering. World War II produced countless examples of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, soldiers and civilians who adapted and improvised and overcame impossible odds through courage and creativity. Most of them never received recognition beyond perhaps a medal ceremony and a handshake from a commanding officer. They returned to civilian life, went back to their jobs and families, and carried their experiences quietly until they died. Their stories died with them, and we are poorer for it. History tends to remember the generals and the grand strategies, the major battles and turning points, but it's built on the accumulated actions of individuals like Callahan, people who saw a problem and fixed it because that's what needed to be done. Every improvised solution, every act of ingenuity under pressure, every moment of courage in the face of overwhelming danger contributed to the outcome. And forgetting those contributions means forgetting what actually wins wars. It's not superior firepower or better strategy, though both matter, it's people. It's the mechanic who builds a flamethrower from scrap metal, and the sergeant who leads his squad through hell, and the medic who keeps men alive under fire. They're the ones who deserve to be remembered. If you've made it this far, if Eugene Callahan's story has meant something to you, then I need to ask something important. Stories like this survive only when people care enough to share them, to pass them down, to ensure that the Eugene Callahans of the world aren't forgotten. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps keep these stories alive and brings them to people who need to hear them. It tells the algorithm that history matters, that the sacrifices of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances deserve attention in a world that's constantly demanding our focus for the trivial and the temporary. This isn't just about engagement metrics or channel growth, though those things matter too. It's about preserving memory, about honoring the debt we owe to people like Callahan, who risked everything so that we could live in a world where the biggest crisis most of us face is a bad commute or a difficult work deadline. They gave everything, and the least we can do is remember. So if this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for a mechanic from Scranton who turned junk into a weapon that saved lives, hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or telling us about a veteran in your own family whose story deserves to be told. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story, because there are thousands more just like this one, waiting to be uncovered and shared. Together we can make sure that heroes like Eugene Callahan aren't lost to history. We can keep their memories alive, one story at a time, one viewer at a time, one generation, passing the torch to the next. That's how we honor them. That's how we say thank you.